of the Global Wind Energy Council, Ben Backwell. Ben?
Hello again, and thank you for coming to this session on the Global Offshore Wind Alliance. This session, as Joyce described it, a sharing of GOWA, which I think is a nice concept. I'll just say a few words, and then I will hand over to Rebecca Williams, our head of Global Offshore Wind, and Simon Ben Mahaz from IRENA, really two of the architects of this program, and who will be able to tell you a lot more about it. I was actually in New York last week, as Joyce said. We decided to launch the initiative on the High Line in New York. I don't know how many of you have been there. It's this former abandoned railway track that runs down the west side of New York. Is now this very beautiful urban park. And we did it just in the section of the High Line where the meatpacking district is, on the High Line. And it was both extremely noisy because we had garbage trucks and construction work going on all around us, and also very, very windy. So it felt quite appropriate in the sense. It was almost like being in a construction site for a wind farm or something like that. But it was a lot of fun, and a good time to do it at the during New York Climate Week and also the UN General Assembly. And we were privileged to have people there from the US government, the Director General of IRENA, Francesca La Camera, the Danish climate ambassador, representatives of many leading companies in the offshore wind space. It was a really, really good event. And this initiative has actually been in the works really for almost a year. The first meeting of the group of countries that is now forming GOWA took place at COP26 in Glasgow, and it's been in kind of stealth mode behind the scenes ever since. And we're now getting very close to the formal launch in Sharm el-Sheikh, and the formal sign-up process of countries is happening. We already have quite a few leading companies who've signed formally, and others which are in that process of moving the documents up to the signature and have signed off on a work plan. And what is GOWA? So about just before COP26, we went to the UN along with IRENA, and we proposed a UN compact. And that compact proposed 380 gigawatts of offshore wind by the end of 2030, 380 gigawatts. And at the time, we thought this was perhaps too ambitious, but we were pushing for something deliberately ambitious. And then, of course, further on to the 2050 timeline to get up to this 2 terawatts of offshore wind that which we will need by then. So it's really dramatic scaling up that we're pushing. We think it's possible. If you think about what's needed on an annual basis, we think it's highly possible, and we look into some of those numbers now. I mean, we did 21 gigawatts of offshore wind last year. If we do 35 gigawatts a year for the rest of the decade, then we're getting kind of into the right territory. So it's not an impossible dream, but it will require a lot of work and a lot of action by the people in this room. Now, the good news is that since we entered this compact into the UN, governments have been moving, as you've seen all around us, right? So the energy crisis and the Russian invasion of Ukraine has really given an impetus to policymakers, and you'll have seen all around the world all these new pledges coming from governments in Europe, but also in Asia and in Latin America and other places. And when we last counted the pledges properly, the pledges added up to something like 370 gigawatts by 2030. So we're, at least on a level of pledges and ambition, we're not that far from the 380, and that's without counting some of the more recent policy statements, for instance, the Baltic declaration that was made just a few weeks ago. So at least on a level of ambition, we are getting towards the kind of territory we want to be in. Now, that doesn't mean that we will get there. It's all about what do we do now, and how do the people in this room and in society and in governments behave over the coming years, right? So just one more remark. So what is GOWA going to do? Because there's lots of initiatives and high-level initiatives and organizations and acronyms, and there seems to be a new climate-focused initiative every couple of weeks at the moment. Now, the reason we think GOWA is going to have a practical impact and a real material impact in the world is because of what it will do. And what will it do? First of all, it's a public-private partnership, so it was formed by the government of Denmark, by IRENA, that represents all the governments around the world taking climate action through the IRENA Assembly and all its different instances, and also GWEC, which represents the global private sector in the wind sector. And the idea is, first of all, to be to act as a mechanism for heightening ambition, so that governments can have a forum and the private sector can have a forum, and key stakeholders can have a forum for raising ambition and continually putting forward new ambition and calculating and measuring the impact we're having. So that's number one, is raising ambition. The second is really to act as a way of transferring knowledge between the between the mature offshore markets and emerging markets. And this is something really not to be underestimated. I mean, it took Europe something like 30 years from the installation of the first offshore wind turbines in Windhoek in 1991 to where we are now. So that's almost 30 years it took Europe to get to where we are now. We can't afford for that amount of time to be spent for other markets, and there's no reason why it should. And there's no reason why we should repeat all the mistakes that we've made, and there's a lot of technical knowledge and history that's gone into this that can be transferred. Every country will do it differently, but there's many ways that we can help countries not make the same mistakes that we made in Europe. So this element of transferring knowledge in a kind of seamless, proactive way, I think, is going to be very, very important. And thirdly, we want GOWA to be a kind of clearinghouse for all the different institutions and governments which are working on this. I mean, as many of you in this room will probably have seen, there is a proliferation of bodies and entities giving advice to emerging market countries, and I sometimes think that these governments must be just kind of tearing their hair out because there's so many people writing reports and trying to give advice. So we really hope that GOWA will help simplify that mechanism, and we'll be able to respond to governments when they request assistance. We already had one country, which I won't name, which wanted to do technical studies around offshore wind. We were able to connect them with other partners, and that project now is taking shape. And we think as countries sign up, it's going to be very, very powerful. We imagine a group of maybe 15 plus countries, and with the private sector then coming in, and not just wind sector, but also energy users, shipping, supply chain, and finance, and all these other actors that are going to be important, as well as communities and stakeholders in different areas as well. So we're really, really excited about this. This is a strategic initiative for GWEC. It's a great group of countries and institutions, and we think this is going to be transformative over the next 10 or 20 years. So I'll leave it there, and we'll welcome Rebecca and Simon onto the stage, and let's hear what they've got to say.
Thanks so much, Ben. Please give Ben a round of applause for those great opening remarks. And as mentioned, we'd like to welcome to our panel Rebecca Williams, who's Global Head of Offshore Wind at Global Wind Energy Council, as well as Simon Ben-Makhaz, who's Head of Technology and Infrastructure at IRENA's Innovation and Technology Center, just a short stone's throw away in Bonn. So for those of you who might be new to the Global Markets Theater, we encourage this to be an interactive discussion space. We'd really like to hear from the industry, some of the members of the audience. So as I line up a few questions to get the panel discussion going, please have a think about what you'd like to know about the Global Offshore Wind Alliance. How's it going to impact your segment of the wind value chain, for instance? Any questions you might have, just raise your hand. We do have folks in the back who are going to be scanning the room and can run a microphone over to you, and I'll make sure to call on you so we can get the audience engaged as part of the session as well. But I think just to get things going, Ben gave a great overview about what GOWA is in terms of activities, so in terms of ambition raising among governments, both mature and emerging markets for offshore wind, in terms of knowledge transfer, knowledge pooling between different communities of practice, and then of course ensuring that we can move at pace to meet this 2030 target of 380 gigawatts of installed offshore wind capacity. Since we have some different representatives of constituencies like industry and governments on stage today, I just wanted to start with an open question about what GOWA will contribute both to industry and to governments from the viewpoint of Irina. So maybe Rebecca, starting with you on the industry perspective, and then we can move to Simon.
Yeah, thank you, Joyce, and it's fantastic to be here with you all today to discuss this initiative, which I've been working on for a considerable while now with my now friend, Simon, who sat here next to me. And I just also want to thank Siemens Gamesa Renewable Energy for their support in this initiative and for sponsoring the session today, so thank you to Siemens Gamesa. So to your question, Joyce, what's in it for industry is what I want to talk to you about right now. And we've already heard from Ben around how the initiative at a high level works and some of the outcomes that we hope to achieve from this. But I think in specifically in terms of what industry can focus on with this initiative, well, from my perspective, I see this as a really important way for us to also have a voice in some of these UN forums and initiatives. So at the moment in the UNFCCC, I feel that GWEC does a very good job of representing the industry in these forums, but we don't yet have a group of kind of countries and constituencies and parties talking on our behalf in some of these forums. And we see GOWA with this grouping of countries as being able to represent the offshore wind sector, industry, community in some of these key international forums. So that's the first thing I want to put out there for your consideration. The second point is that, as Ben said, this is very much a public-private partnership, and we've really seen the success from an industry perspective of public-private partnerships in many of the key markets that we've been working with. So to name just a few, I'm thinking about Japan, the UK, which have both taken, and Denmark, which have both all taken a very strong approach to public-private partnership. And those of us who are from the industry in this room will know the importance of having that very close dialogue with governments when they're in a position to be setting up an offshore wind industry. The third thing is that this is all about implementation. This is not just another initiative, which, as Ben said, is a kind of high-level, floaty-around initiative that doesn't achieve anything. When we're launching this initiative, we're launching it with 3 key work streams, which will focus on the following topics: marine spatial planning, stakeholder management, and leasing and permitting; market design and how we can bring about markets and the best framework for the offshore wind industry in that market; and then the third work stream, which is all around supply chain coordination and cooperation with the global international supply chain. So I think that having these very concrete work streams, which are all major challenges that I think we'll agree the industry is facing in more or less every market that we're working in, I think there's a real chance for a very productive dialogue between government and industry that will really shift the dial and have a transformational effect. I'll finish there, and there's lots more to say, but I'll hand back to Joyce now.
Great. Thanks so much, Rebecca. So Simon, over to you from Irina's perspective. How can GOWA contribute to governments, both emerging markets for offshore wind as well as those that are leading the way?
Thank you, Joyce. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, GWEC, for inviting Irina to this event. 2 elements very important. First, we saw a gap, and second, it makes so much sense. So the first, there was a gap. Irina has worked with many countries. We have a global membership of 168 countries, and we work prior to COP26 in Glasgow to work with countries to enhance their pledges towards the Paris Agreement. And we saw a gap in terms of credibility, meaning that we are already in 2022. We have only 8 years to 2030, which will be an important milestone for the Paris Agreement. And there was a need to accelerate how countries build up renewable energy in their climate plans. And for that, The need, of course, was to work on the policy frameworks, helping countries understand better the nature of offshore, how it can bring about the power sector flexibility, how well it can integrate with other sectors, connect well with green hydrogen and so on, but also working with the private sector to find solutions to accelerate the deployment of offshore renewable. Because you know, it takes very long time to build offshore wind farms. So we need now, first, the political will to really commit to enabling faster permitting, for example, but also for the developing countries, find a solution around climate finance. And those are actually very important priority for the next COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. COP27, Rebecca, you mentioned, will be the COP of implementation. What does it mean? First, we need to close the gap in terms of ambition of countries. So the developed country needs to enhance their NDC, which are the short-term climate plan, but of course align toward 2050 vision, toward net zero. And in that perspective, offshore makes so much sense. ARENA tracks the potential, but also the decrease in cost of different technologies. We promote all forms of renewable energy, but we saw that offshore wind is on a really very fast cost reduction track. Between 2010 and 2020, already 50% decrease, and we predict that by 2030, more than 40% cost reduction will happen again. So country needs to be aware of those elements and build credible canal plans. To do so, there was a need to bring the public and the private together to work, as you, Rebecca, you mentioned, on concrete elements. Because of course, when you go into new markets, they never heard about offshore or very high-level information. GOWA, thanks to its partners, the private sector, and also the international organization, will bring with a concrete set of activity that really enable, at the end, first to bridge the gap in terms of ambition, but also close the gap in terms of climate finance. Because to access finance, developed countries needs to bring credible project, credible pipeline of projects that are bankable. And GOWA really at the core will help to accelerate those issues with the different actors.
Great. Well said. Thank you so much, Simon. I'd like to dive a little bit more into the proliferation of offshore wind into emerging markets and developing economies. As yesterday, the Global Markets Theater ran a series of sessions that focused on Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and thinking about not just the opportunities that offshore wind can bring to these regions, which I'm sure we're all in violent agreement about, but the barriers and the bottlenecks, as Simon began to scratch the surface of. So we hear a lot about grid integration bottlenecks, about financing, finding investable frameworks, about the need for technology transfer, supply chain limitations. Just for the wider panel, and Simon, feel free to elaborate on these points as well, in terms of making GOWA a reality, not just getting the ambition raised, but getting the implementation part to happen in emerging markets and developing economies. What are the major barriers that you're seeing for offshore wind to take off? Yeah, please go ahead.
No, you take it first.
So I think we've covered a lot of the barriers and bottlenecks in previous panels and discussions, but I think the great thing about GOWA is that, as we've said, we've got 3 key work streams which will zone in on some of these barriers. So if we take the issue of marine spatial planning and stakeholder management, for instance, I think certainly in our conversations with governments around the world, this is the one that they raise again and again. This is probably the key challenge for them in terms of managing the different stakeholders that they have. But also it's a key barrier for the industry. We don't have enough sites out there. We don't have enough projects. We've been very clear about that over the last few days. Leasing is not at the moment connected, I don't think, in more or less any market to the ambition. So leasing is not done quickly enough. There's not enough volume out there. And also, in terms of this challenge around how we do marine spatial planning, but do it fast, and we do it in a way that meets the needs of all these different stakeholders, but in a way that then prioritizes offshore wind, I think we really need to come together as a global community of practice between government and industry and really get some solutions on the table about how to do that better, how to do it faster, and how to do it more effectively.
Yes, so in terms of barriers, of course, depending on the type of country, the region we are working on, the countries are facing different issues. For example, we have many questions for small island states which want to develop new form of renewable energy, and of course offshore and marine renewables are at the top of their priorities. We see 5 elements really important. The first one is about enabling frameworks and policy development. So there needs to be a viable mechanism for government to really connect with the private sector, to allocate resources so that projects are credible when the private sector is talking to a bank, and really they need to understand what is behind the certainty of the purchase of energy. The second is about financial de-risking. Of course, offshore has evolved in the last 5 to 10 years, and the latest information with the different members of the value chain of a project needs to understand the recent developments. So de-risking the financial transaction will be important, especially when you add the risk of a specific country. So basically meaning that the premium of the project increase. The third is about system integration. Of course, the beauty of offshore is that it can be developed in many forms. We are talking about offshore, floating, connecting to, I mentioned, green hydrogen, linking with different type of technology to connect to the land, and so on. The fourth one is about, of course, enabling government to understand the socio-economic benefits. So really to understand that there is an added value behind offshore wind in terms of industry, manufacturing, job creation along the value chain, from construction, but of course along the 20, 30, maybe more of the O&M phase, really to understand what are the new jobs and how to convert, for example, the conventional offshore workforce to the new type of project. And of course, at the end is to bring together stakeholder engagement to really facilitate the discussion around what does it take to bring an offshore project or offshore pipeline of project to a country that has not yet developed a strong track record. And IRENA really want to focus and help this discussion with emerging countries which announce, for example, high ambition, but so far have modest development in terms of offshore track.
Great. Thank you so much, both. I think the crux of GOWA is this management of ambition and knowledge with speed. So this is the other kind of third component that undergirds the new initiative. And it would be interesting to hear from the panelists on the greatest challenge when it comes to speed. So for instance, permitting is something we haven't yet spoken about. It's an area, as I think most of us recognize, experiences the greatest attrition when it comes to project development timelines. Where are you seeing the permitting challenge and bottleneck play out in real time? I think this is quite universal. It's not about developed or developing economy, but where have you seen this challenge really start to manifest? Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
So I mean, a couple of observations. Even in the best countries, everything takes crazy long time. And I mean, I'm talking about, use the country where I live, the UK. I mean, it's pretty successful. And it's been, one of the most successful countries in the world in building a very big offshore pipeline and implementing, right? But even there, I have a local wind farm near where I live, and they are in the process of doing a stage 2, a much bigger stage 2 development, and they've just put in their planning. I saw the scoping document for that. And it's like a telephone directory. I mean, it's literally that thick, and it was probably 2 years of consultant studies to do it. And then you have to go and consult with every single stakeholder. The onus is on you to go and contact them, and the onus is on you to chase them if they don't reply, and then and manage all that process. It's incredible complexity. You're talking about everybody who might be able to see the wind farm. You're talking about every piece of land that the cable, the onshore cable, goes to the substation, and every agency that might have some kind of oversight on every impact that it may have. You're talking about aviation, you're talking about military, you're talking about every type of maritime agency. I mean, that's not going to work for the climate emergency, in my opinion. I mean, there has to be processes where simplification, where there's proactive management by a single government agency. The onus cannot be on the developer to chase every reply. There needs to be a centralization. And people have tried to deal with this in different ways. And as you know, in some places around the world, the model is the more centralized model, where government takes on a lot of that process and establishes the areas. Grid, the same thing. I mean, we need to be looking at where the balance is and where the onus is around who does the grid, who plans it, who pays for it. The other point that's related to this is that for so long, this was just about squeezing out cost. And I think that was a very, very necessary process that we went through as an industry to establish offshore wind as a competitive large-scale power industry. But let's face it, we have a situation now where fossil fuel prices are so high, and the disparity between where we're at as an industry in terms of the power we can supply and fossil power, it's a huge disparity. We don't need to be squeezing out every single cent out of the supply chain and out of the energy producers. I think the onus needs to change to be around efficiency, around speed, around proactive government that can centralize its processes in a way that helps the private sector to be able to build these projects. I mean, we can bring the money, and we can bring investors, and we can bring great technology, and we can help train people. But if we can't get government to be more efficient, we're not going to be able to do this. So I think probably the biggest issue we face is complexity, and it is a complex issue because these are big projects, but we need to reduce complexity. And then I think the other thing is complexity on a kind of design level. I mean, so often governments take years, literally years, to decide their market frameworks. And again, they're listening to advice from many people. They're responding to different impetuses and pushes from different government agencies, sometimes from finance ministry to emphasize cost over everything else. And I think what GOWA, I hope, can do, we're not going to be able to tell countries what to do, and I don't think that's the approach. Everyone will have their own approach. But I think what GOWA can do is put on the table very clear options and case studies and learnings where governments can quite easily choose paths that will take them to a regulatory design much quicker.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Ben. And just to put some numbers against that permitting challenge, GWEC has done some analysis combining our market intelligence with a Renewable UK database, so that's the Renewable Energy Association in the UK, and we looked at the track record of what project timing looks like in different segments, and from lease award to full commissioning of an offshore wind project, taking a global average between Taiwan, the UK, different European jurisdictions, China, etc. It takes about 9 years on a global average for lease award to full commissioning of an offshore wind farm. And as mentioned earlier, we're about 8 years, and 8 years less actually, away from 2030. So this is it's an unworkable formula when it comes to moving at speed. That said, I think we can start to look at the other side of the coin, which is what can we do about it? What are the opportunities for policy and regulatory reform, which can help to ease some of the challenges, MSP, including workforce planning, et cetera, that have come out during this panel. The two packages which have probably been most prominent at this conference, and certainly in New York during Climate Week last week, are of course the Inflation Reduction Act out of the US and the Repower EU framework released earlier this year. So to the panel, I'm just wondering, in terms of easing offshore wind barriers and bottlenecks, what are some of the hopefully good practices, once we see them being implemented on the ground, that we are seeing in these packages? What can we take from these pieces of legislation that could be carried forward into other countries? Simon,
yes,
start with you.
Thank you, Joyce. I'd like to start maybe from the European perspective. We are in Hamburg today. The Repower EU offer a wide range of opportunity for offshore to scale today. Of course, the industry is sensitive about, from the announcement, how it will be reflected in terms of actually boot on the ground, so financing, country taking risk in the project, actually really for the project to happen. So in terms of the initiative, good practices, maybe two I want to highlight. First, for example, the case of the Netherlands, where there is the ministry which is conducting a resource assessment campaign to help prepare the sites so they are actually ready for the private sector to take over and build the farm. So this is a very good example of the ministry and the private sector talking to each other and highlighting what it needs. And the second, at the EU level, there is funding opportunity like the Innovation Fund, which places a lot of emphasis on those huge opportunities for offshore wind, and of course de-risking those projects because the EU takes a share and finance a part of the project together with the private sector. So those are, I think, in the track of Repower EU are very important. Increase the financing so the private sector accelerate and can bring more projects to fruition. And second, de-risking the early project development because of course the timelines are not compressible too much. And of course, if you put too much pressure on the construction side, of course the industry will suffer and this will not be conducive for achieving the climate target.
Yeah, well said. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one element we've not touched upon yet from the GOWA perspective is perhaps the role of concessional finance in some of these markets, because we don't have a problem with financing as a whole. You know, we don't have a shortage of money in the industry. We have a shortage of projects. But I think a particularly acute area for some of the markets that we're working in is for those governments, the gap between the power price and the potential price that offshore wind would start at in that market. So I think GOWA can certainly help in this regard. We are talking to many of the other institutions. This is a partnership between the private sector, the public sector, and also key institutions such as development banks. And I think for such markets, we're going to have to see a strong role there for kind of blended financial products which take into account concessional financing of either key infrastructure priorities like grid infrastructure, or looking at things like potentially financial products to address this gap between the power price as it is right now and where it kind of could be in the future. So I just wanted to bring that to the discussion as well.
Yeah. Thanks so much to both of you. We're getting close to the end of our session, so I just want to do one final scan of the audience here to see if there are any questions. And I do see one in the back for those who have the microphone. Just the gentleman at the back of the aisle. Please introduce yourself, which organization you're with before asking your question.
Sure, thanks. Stefan Barth, I'm the current chairman of IEA Wind, and at IEA we're already working on some of those topics on offshore wind consenting, and it will be very interesting how we can support these initiatives and bring our results and activities in this GOWA activity.
Yeah, sure, Rebecca.
Yeah, great question. And this is something that I was going to come on to as kind of a next steps discussion. But I'm sure many of you in the room who are from particular companies will want to know how you can get involved, how you can support this initiative. And the good news is we want you to all get involved. This is a partnership between the private and the public sector. Here at GWEC, we're providing the kind of conduit for the private sector. So please do come to us and talk to us about how you can get involved. At the moment, we're scoping out what the industry kind of contribution looks like. We're just going to put some parameters around that. From the countryside, to sign up to GOWA, you have to sign a kind of call to action statement, which commits you to a series of actions. So here from the GWEC side, we're currently scoping out what the industry commitment will be, and we hope to return to you all with that information very shortly ahead of COP27.
Could I add as well that we will be involving multilaterals, some of the kind of important international institutions as well. We've been approached by quite a few institutions, but also the wider private sector as well. As I said, not just it's not just the wind industry, it's about finance and shipping and many other sectors as well, but also multilateral development banks as well have approached us. So there will be some kind of advisory board committee as well feeding in from other institutions as well. So very happy to have that conversation with you as well.
Maybe also one element also fundamental to the GOWA initiative is that we really want to look carefully at avoiding or overlaps or duplication of work. So from the start, we understand what is the landscape and how we can collaborate with existing initiative organization, of course, to really bring the best knowledge to the people that needs to be aware to scale up offshore in the different markets.
And maybe just one final point on that as well. I mean, we've designed this initiative to be kind of as light touch as it can be. We don't want to empire build and make a whole new initiative that has layers and layers and layers of complexity. We've gone for the simplest kind of governance model that we could think of. And we want to make sure, as Simon says, that we're not kind of having loads of different bodies just duplicating effort and not getting us anywhere. So absolutely, we'd love to talk to you all about how we can use what you're doing and integrate that into GOWA.
Great, thanks so much. So I think that's an open invitation to stick around after this session. Please come approach Ben, Rebecca, and Simon if you're interested in learning more about GOWA, getting involved, and of course to the gentleman who asked the question, that goes for you as well. Please do stick around and ask us more about it. Just a final look around. Are there any last questions before we close this session? All right. In that case, a big thank you to our panelists today for joining us, Ben and Rebecca from Global Wind Energy Council, as well as Simon from the Bonn Technology and Innovation Center of IRENA. Please join me in thanking them for sharing their thoughts on this new exciting initiative, Global Offshore Wind Alliance.